Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about macromolecules. So this is the section that y'all read yesterday, section 6.4, which macromolecules are the building blocks of life. So to start out this section, we need to talk a little bit about organic chemistry. So if any of y'all decide to major in some type of science in college, there's a good chance you're going to have to take organic chemistry. I had to take it. Organic chemistry is the study of all compounds that contain bonds between carbon atoms. So a lot of times life on Earth is considered to be carbon-based because carbon is an essential element. So why carbon? Well, carbon can bond with many elements because it has 4 electrons available to bond. Remember when we talked about those outer energy levels when we talked about protons, electrons, and neutrons? So remember, the first energy level can only hold 2, and the second energy level can hold 8. Well, carbon has a total of 6 electrons. So there's 2 that fill up that first level, and then we have 4 left over in the outer level, meaning we can take 4 more on to balance that out. So carbon has 4 electrons available to bond. Carbon can bond to other carbons and thus make long chains of itself. So macromolecules are large molecules that are formed by joining smaller organic molecules together. So remember, organic meaning having carbon. So many monomers equals a polymer. So remember, mono means one and poly means many. So we have many of these monomers that bond and they make these polymers. So there are 4 groups of organic compounds found in living organisms that we are going to focus in on. They're carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. So here's just kind of a little bit of an idea. So we have macromolecules, that's our big picture. From that, we have 4 things. We have carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And these out here are just telling you what they're composed of. So like, notice all of them have carbon. C is carbon. All of them have hydrogen, and all of them have oxygen. So this one has nitrogen, and this one has nitrogen and phosphorus. So let's start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are compounds made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, meaning for every 1 carbon, there are 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. Living things use carbohydrates as their main source of energy, right? Our main source of energy as living things is food. So living things use carbohydrates as their main source of energy. Plants and some animals also use carbs for structural purposes. So as humans, like, we like to eat bread and fried chicken and all of these things that have carbs, but plants and animals eat them as well or use them as well just for structural purposes instead of food purposes like what we would do. So there are 3 types of carbohydrates. There are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So saccharides are sugars, okay? So if we have mono means 1, so monosaccharide is 1 sugar. Disaccharide, di means 2, so that's 2 sugars. And then polysaccharide, poly means many, so those have many sugars. So examples of each of these we use literally on a daily basis. So just a little bit of review, right? We have this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, obviously, there's more than 1, 2, and 1 here, but if you were to simplify this, for every 1 carbon, we would have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, right? Because 6 goes into 6 1 time and into 12 2 times. Typically, carbohydrates are going to end in ose. So an example would be sucrose. So monosaccharides, remember one sugar, glucose, there's that ose, that's found in sports drinks, that's a monosaccharide, and fructose, that's found in fruits, is a monosaccharide. Some disaccharides would be like a sugar beet or sugar cane, that's sucrose. Corn is maltose, and dairy products has lactose. So anytime you hear a word that ends in tose or ose, you know that we're talking about carbs here. We're talking about some type of sugar. Then we have polysaccharides, right, which is a complex carb. It makes sense because that's a larger polysaccharide. So starch is an example of a polysaccharide. It's glucose energy stored up in plants. So breads, pastas, potatoes, those all have that starch, that glucose. That's a polysaccharide. So here are some examples. Notice here we have one sugar, so that's mono. Here we have two, so that's di. And then here we have a whole chain of them, which is poly. So this one here is glucose, this two is sucrose, and here is amylose starch. And if you remember when we talked about enzymes, we talked about the enzyme found in your saliva that's called amylase, and its sole job is to break down amylose. So the three main types of polysaccharides that we will deal with or that you'll come in contact with is cellulose. That's found in plant cell walls. Those give support. Starch, those are in plants. Those store energy. So those are our potatoes, our corn, pasta, bread. That's why a lot of times, like before you exercise or before you go run or whatever, people will say load up on carbs, right? Because those store energy. Glycogen, those form from digested starch, and those are stored in muscle and provide energy. So that kind of ties in with that starch, with eating things like that before you work out. That's why, because it stores up in muscles and provides energy for the body. So we've talked about carbohydrates. Now we're going to talk about lipids. So lipids are molecules made mostly of carbon and hydrogen that make up the fats, oils, and waxes. These are not soluble in water. They do not dissolve in water. They are composed of fatty acids, glycerol, and other components. So lipids can store energy. That's one of the jobs that it does. And some are important parts of biological membranes and waterproof coverings. So for example, plant leaves are coated with lipids called waxes to prevent water loss. And like a honeycomb in a beehive is made of beeswax. So we have these protective coverings and things like that in biological membranes that are made up of lipids. So here is kind of a breakdown of lipid. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They are made up of glycerol and three fatty acids shaped like an E. So those are called triglycerides. They do not dissolve in water. They don't dissolve in alcohol or ether. And then examples of lipids are fats, wax, cholesterol, oil, cell membrane. So let's talk a little bit more about triglycerides. So triglycerides are fats and oils. When it's a solid at a room temperature, it's a fat. When it's liquid at room temperature, it's an oil. So triglycerides are stored in the fat cells of the body. So there are all kinds of different lipids, okay? There are LDLs, HDLs, anabolic steroids, sex hormones, plant steroids, but the two that we're going to focus the most on are unsaturated fats and saturated fats. So saturated fat is liquid at room temperature, An unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature, and a saturated fat is solid at room temperature. So talking a little bit more about these, the basic structure of a lipid is a fatty acid tail. The tail is a chain of carbon atoms bonded to hydrogen and other carbon atoms by single or double bonds. It's important with the single and double bonds because those are what differentiate between a saturated and an unsaturated fat. A single bonded tail is saturated, and a double bonded tail is unsaturated. Now, if there's more than one double bond, that's called polyunsaturated, right? Because poly means multiple, means many. So if there's more than one double bond, it's polyunsaturated. So I know that's a little confusing, but let's look at this picture. So here we have this triglyceride. Remember, we said it's shaped like an E. So here's our E shape. Now notice these are all single bonds, so those are considered to be saturated. However, this one has a double bond right here, so that's unsaturated. If we would have had an additional double bond somewhere in this chain, then it would be polyunsaturated, but it's still unsaturated. So phospholipids are a specific type of lipid. They are responsible for the structure and function of the cell membrane. Lipids are hydrophobic, meaning they're water-fearing. So hydro means water, phobic means fear. So if something is hydrophobic, it hates water, it's not going to dissolve in water. That characteristic of being hydrophobic is important because it allows lipids to serve as barriers in biological membranes, right? So when we're talking about the coating of a beehive or the coating of a plant, the fact that it's hydrophobic is important because it serves as a barrier. Because it's not dissolvable in water, water is not going to affect that plant. So steroids are another important category of lipids. Steroids include substances such as cholesterol and hormones. And despite its reputation as a bad lipid, cholesterol provides the starting point for other necessary lipids, such as vitamin D and the hormones estrogen and testosterone. And estrogen and testosterone are those sex hormones that was shown on a previous slide. So now let's talk about proteins. Proteins is another primary building block of living things. A protein is a compound made of small carbon compounds called amino acids. So amino acids are made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and sometimes sulfur. And all amino acids share the same general structure. So let's talk a little bit about that amino acid structure. They have a central carbon atom. Now remember, we said at the very start of this section that carbon has 4 electrons in that outer layer, meaning it can have 4 bonds. So in an amino acid structure, those 4 bonds, one is with a hydrogen, one is with an amino group, which has nitrogen, 2 hydrogens. Another one is with a carboxyl group, meaning it has carbon, 2 oxygens, and a hydrogen. And then a variable group, and that's represented by this R because it can be a whole combination of things. So this variable group here is what makes each amino acid different, right? Because every amino acid is going to have hydrogen, amino group, and carboxyl group. It's this variable group that makes each amino acid different. So there are 20 different variable groups, and proteins are made of different combinations of all 20 different amino groups. So a peptide bond, those are covalent bonds that join amino acids together to form proteins. So a peptide bond is formed between the amino group of one amino acid and the carboxyl group of another. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here is the structure of amino acids, right? Here are those three groups. Here's that amino group here. See, it has that nitrogen and the two hydrogens. Here's the hydrogen. And here is that carboxyl group. It has carbon, oxygen, oxygen, and hydrogen. This R represents the variable group. So here, with these two, we have the same three here, but they're different because they have different variable groups. Okay, here's another example of that. Here's those three that are the same, and then here's another variable group. So this specific protein is called cysteine. Now, remember we said a peptide bond forms between the amino group of one and the carboxyl group of another. So proteins are extremely important. They make up 15% of total body mass, and they are involved in nearly every bodily function. So your muscles, your skin, your hair, they are all made up of proteins. So that's why it's really important that you eat protein, right? People always harp on protein, 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 and that's because it is such a vital part of our body. Cells contain about 10,000 different proteins that provide structural support. They transport substances inside the cell and between cells. They communicate signals within the cell and between cells. They speed up chemical reactions, and they control cell growth. So, like an enzyme, that's a protein, remember? Enzymes speed up chemical reactions. So proteins are extremely, extremely important to the body and its functions. So here we are, just a quick review of proteins. They're made up of amino acids, which have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And they're the building blocks of life. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to amino acids as the building blocks of life. Because proteins, they start out as amino acids, they make proteins, and then those proteins form structures like organs in your body and spider webs, your hair, bones, feathers. So many things are made up of proteins. And then the metabolic purpose of a protein, they're enzymes that usually end in ase. So remember, we said amylose, right? There's that ose. We know that that's a saccharide. We know that that's a carbohydrate. And then we have ase, which is a protein that breaks down amylose. So finally, our fourth group of biological molecules are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are complex macromolecules that store and transmit or pass on hereditary info. So this is what passes on genetics, genetic information. Nucleic acids are made up of smaller repeating subunits called nucleotides. Nucleotides are composed of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and hydrogen atoms. So they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those are what make up nucleotides. There are 6 major types of nucleotides, and all 6 have 3 units. They have a phosphate, a nitrogen base, and a ribose sugar, which we'll talk more about those structures when we get more into genetic information, but you do need to understand the basis. You need to understand that nucleotides are made up of these 3 things. There are 2 types of nucleic acids found in living organisms. There's DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, and then there's RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. So here is the nucleotide structure. It has that sugar, it has that phosphate, and then it has this nitrogen-containing base. So the nucleic acid structure, nucleic acids, those DNA and RNA, are made up of repeating nucleotides. So notice here we have this chain, and it is made up, remember the three things. We have sugar, 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 sugar. So there's one. Then we have phosphate, 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 phosphate. There's the second ingredient. And then we have the third ingredient, which is that nitrogen-containing base. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So with ATP, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, meaning it has 3 phosphate groups, right? Tri means 3. So adenotriphosphate. ATP is important because it is the storehouse of chemical energy in the body. We are going to use ATP so much when we talk about different biological processes. So we'll talk more about this, but just as kind of a little bit of an introduction, ATP is the storehouse of chemical energy, and it releases energy when the bond between the second and third phosphate group is broken. So that is just kind of a brief introduction to some of the processes and some of the components of biological processes that we'll talk about throughout this year. But all 4 of these are super important. So you need to be sure that you're familiar with the 4 types of macromolecules. Remember, we have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids.